Good evening, everyone. I'm Keith Crumwoody, Dean of the Architecture Division at California College of the Arts. Thanks for joining us tonight for this lecture by Ashley Bigham and Erik Herrmann of Outpost Office, the second event of our Fall 2021 Architecture Lecture Series. If you'd like, you can enable closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom window with the live transcript button. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you're joining us virtually today. The lecture tonight is the keynote event for the exhibition Drawing Codes Volume 2, currently on view at CCA's Humboldt Street Galleries. Drawing Codes was organized by Adam Marcus, an associate professor of architecture here at CCA, and Andrew Cudlis, currently a professor of architecture at the University of Houston and formerly a professor at CCA. The show was originally conceived by Andrew and Adam as part of the Digital Craft Lab, one of the 4 research and teaching labs here at CCA. Before I hand this over to Adam, I'd like to tell you about the next event in our series, a lecture on Wednesday, October 6th at 5 p.m. by Carrie Norman and Thomas Kelly, who will present work of their office, Norman Kelly. You can find the full spring lecture schedule, along with stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. And now I'll pass the virtual mic to Adam, who will introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Keith. It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce Ashley Bigham and Erik Herrmann of Outpost Office. Ashley and Erik are assistant professors of architecture at the Knowlton School at The Ohio State University in Columbus. Their work with Outpost Office has been awarded, published, and exhibited internationally and supported by a number of fellowships, Ashley with a Fulbright, Erik with a German Chancellor Fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and both with MacDowell Fellowships. Tonight's event is nearly 18 months in the making, believe it or not. Ashley and Erik were originally invited to CCA for a workshop and lecture in April 2020 to coincide with the opening of the exhibition Drawing Codes, Experimental Protocols of Architectural Representation, Volume 2, which I co-curated with Andrew Cudlis, as Keith mentioned. Of course, fate intervened in the form of a global pandemic, precluding both the exhibition and the visit last spring. But this fall, as the college prepared to reopen, we were finally able to install the show, which is on view now at CCA's Humboldt Street Galleries through October 8th, and once again extend the invitation to Ashley and Erik. I'm going to quickly share my screen. The pair have been in a sort of remote residency at CCA this past week, leading a terrific workshop with students this past weekend, some of the work you see here. Zooming in for an exhibition and conversation in the nave on Monday with faculty guests from the architecture program, and now here tonight for a presentation of their work. I wanted to say just a few brief words about the Drawing Codes exhibition as a way to give a little bit of context. Andrew and I began the project in 2017 with the first volume of the show, which invited 24 contributors to produce a drawing in response to a series of prompts related to the role of code in architectural design and representation. After the show traveled from San Francisco to LA, Ann Arbor, and Columbus, we decided to expand the project and commissioned 24 additional drawings for a second volume, which opened at the Cooper Union in January 2019, traveled to Charlottesville, Miami, and Seattle, and now is finally on view at CCA. For this, I want to extend a special thanks to Jamie Austin, CCA's Director of Exhibitions and Public Programming, and her colleagues Brandice and Manuel for making this happen and doing such a beautiful job installing the show. One of our goals for the Drawing Codes project was to expand the conversation about digital processes in architecture beyond what we saw as a sometimes limited association of computation with specific formal agendas, twisty towers, exuberantly panelized surfaces, and the like. Our hope was to showcase much broader, more diverse, more critical, and more sophisticated engagements with computational thinking. Another villa, the drawing produced by Outpost Office for the second volume, which I encourage you all to go see in the gallery in person, I think exemplifies our aspirations for the show. The drawing, which you'll learn more about tonight, reinterprets the plan of Palladio's Villa Rotunda through simple processes of recursion that increasingly abstract the villa's geometry to a point of near illegibility. Like much of Outpost Office's work, the drawing is deeply rooted in computational thinking and yet simultaneously in dialogue with architectural history and precedent. It is retro yet contemporary, high-tech yet lo-fi, disciplinary yet accessible, playfully irreverent yet deadly serious. This sensibility extends to their architectural work as well, most recently in a series of large-scale spatial robotic drawing projects, which I'm sure we'll get to see tonight. What strikes me about this work is that while Outpost Office is clearly engaging with processes like abstraction, randomness, procedural design, and robotic fabrication, these are always leveraged for some form of public engagement, community building, or in the case of this past weekend's workshop, collaborative participation and authorship. At a so-called post-digital moment in architecture in which we may be tempted to critique computation by rejecting it altogether, Outpost Office offers, I think, a less cynical alternative that leans on technology to help us engage in the messiness of the world, still critical, yet also insistently optimistic. It's been so great to have Ashley and Erik here, spending time with us this week, and I look forward to seeing their presentation tonight. So please join me in virtually welcoming Ashley Bigham and Erik Herrmann to CCA.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was so nice and wonderful. We had really an amazing Saturday and Monday with the students. They did brilliant work, and congratulations to them for following us into a somewhat strange drawing code. It was it was a lot of that. It was really inspired by the prompt of the exhibition, which looks so beautiful in your gallery. Congratulations on that. And so it was really inspired by the way that exhibition constructs rules around drawings. And as we'll talk about tonight, we often construct rules and use rules to our advantage in our design practice as well. And the Villa Rotunda drawing is just one of those examples. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. It's really generous. So since this is like the conclusion of our, can you see me?
I'm going to share screen.
You're going to share screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, here, let's.
Great.
Can you guys see that?
Good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so the lecture tonight is entitled Drawing a Field, which is, a little bit a nod in reference to the workshop that the students did. It's a little bit of a nod and a reference to we are 18 months departed from the time that we intended to give this talk, and also we are physically separated from you guys. But we're really, really lucky to have this opportunity, and we really appreciate all the support and love being part of the show. Mm-hmm. So we do encourage everyone to go to the gallery and see the show. As Adam was mentioning, this is our piece, Another Villa, which I was just reading the interview on the Scaffold magazine you guys have put up, which is a really remarkable platform. And I think we were just speaking with Keith about the kind of transition into something digital, and it's going to be, I think, a great legacy for a difficult moment to create something that really brings a way to chronicle the life of the school in a super compelling way. And I was reading the interview, and you guys mentioned something that I hadn't really thought about in a while, which was our statement, where we come across and we say a little bit of a nonchalance. And so I think that what I would encourage people to do if they go to the gallery is that one of the things about the design is that we weren't kidding. We really didn't code this. It's done in the crudest way possible. And so if you look closely, there are mistakes. There are things that are actually missing. And so even though the recursion is perfect, we are imperfect. And I would encourage students to go and get a little close and find all those wonderful kind of mistakes. So a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight comes from us kind of reflecting on the role of drawing and the role of codes in our show, obviously kind of answering and speaking to being the keynote of this extraordinary event, which is a tough act to follow the great show. It's a tough act to follow the intro. But we were thinking back to this moment when we were at a conference and a colleague pulled us aside and she just said, like, out of nowhere, super matter of factly, like people do amongst peers, just, do you guys make any drawings? And it was just such like a funny comment to hear. And we were like, yeah, of course we make a lot of drawings. And she was like, no, do you make drawings? Like, and she was talking about the fact that despite the amount of work that she was doing, most things were getting transcribed through like digital models, through fragments. She was doing very few like formal drawings.
Emails,
lots of emails and lots of different forms of notation. And she talked about how, we talked with her about how drawing is a central act in architecture still, but this no longer extends exclusively from its authority as a bureaucratic instrument. And that's probably a good thing. And so the question was for us, as we're looking through putting this lecture together, it's not really about what is drawing or should we be drawing? It's more of a question of like, where is drawing in the work? If drawing is no longer a part of this kind of expected bureaucratic process, where are we locating drawing? How is drawing instrumentalized in our work? And what forms is it taking? And so in order to do that, we're going to actually start with this project, which is another Campo Marzio. So this project actually is from the era in which we produced another villa project for the drawing codes. So these are a series of ASCII drawings, and we have an architectural audience with us today. And so there might be glimmers of recognition as these flip by. But I think that what interests us here and what we wanted to demonstrate is that they embody a very distinct idea we have, a very clear idea we have about digitalization. So as Adam noted, like, you know, we don't see it as a kind of stylistic trope, and we resist fetishizing the technology. But what we do understand the digital as a kind of, as a format. So here in this case, you're seeing all of these buildings that have been transcribed to a kind of virtual encoding, you know, reduced in Notepad to a series of symbols. And so the materiality, the scale, the history, all those things have kind of been stripped away. And it has the kind of ontological flatness that we see in the way that the kind of databases and the computation that used to be kind of foregrounded in our lives has actually moved into the background and kind of quietly hums in the background and controlling even our most analog of experiences. And so another Campo Marzio is a drawing apparatus, and it's a project that celebrates drawing as a useless machine. We were reading this Tafuri piece where he references Parnasi's original Campo Marzio, which is a representation that is a space for speculation. It's not a real drawing, it's a fictive speculation. And it combines freely from historical fragments and also imagination. And there's incredible potency to that. And Tafuri talks about it as a useless machine. And so we got really intrigued by this idea of, there's a long legacy in digitalization of useless machines. The perfect machine is actually described as a machine where you turn on a box, a hand comes out and turns the machine off itself. And so kind of working in that genre seemed like something that would be really interesting to us. And we were really interested in trying to translate these ideas into not a drawing specifically, but again, a drawing apparatus. So here you're seeing the drawing apparatus, which is simply a dot matrix printer positioned on a pedestal. It's attached to a Raspberry Pi microcomputer. And so no two performances of this are precisely alike. Essentially, it goes through a database of the plans that we were just looking at. And this is the actual speed it runs at, very, very mundane in the gallery, this kind of gentle hum of the printer. I'm not going to turn the sound on, it just absolutely screeches and it fills whatever space it's in. But the installation adopts the destabilizing capacity of the digital format, which often presents information without any kind of proper context or without even causation. This tendency echoes the work of Parnasi in the original Campo Marzio etchings, wherein the artist freely recombines fragments with literal no historical or archaeological precision. So it's about representation as a space for spectacle, projection, misreading, misappropriation, and misuse. And it's probably the oldest project in the office in the sense that it's been a book, it's been a series of gifts, it's been a series of installations, it's been projected.
It's been a film projected on the streets of Chicago. Yeah.
It's taken a lot of different forms, including the most recent form, which is going to kind of reappear in a small show at Yale. And in this case, this is an extension of the project where users to the gallery can press a button and each user gets a completely individualized drawing. Amazing, yeah. And so for us, like, this project is really important to kind of the intersections that Adam was describing, are questions of technology with history, kind of highbrow, lowbrow combinations, and a way,
Precedent with new things.
yeah, exactly. And like a way of working where maybe the question of when drawing appears in the process and the status of the drawing is kind of brought into question.
So right now we're working on, in addition to these sort of overarching things in a lot of our projects, we're working on two types of work, and one that we're calling platforms for gathering, a kind of loose way of talking about several projects that engage social aspects, whether it's gathering groups together for performances or for activities or educational purposes. And the first one we're going to talk about is Drawing Fields, which was the Ragdale 2020 competition. Which, as Adam alluded to, the competition was held in March 2020. So all of a sudden, when we were no longer coming to California, we thought we would kind of quickly put together this competition entry because we had this inclination and idea about a GPS-guided painting robot, which we sort of knew existed as a product and as a machine. Never used by architects. It's used by people to paint sports fields. So the typical reason you would have a machine like this is to paint a football field or a baseball diamond or soccer field. It does that quite easily and it's pre-programmed to do that. But like a lot of tools we use, we're always kind of taking things from other disciplines or other professions, misusing them, reappropriating them, working on the kind of limits of the tool and the technology. And as far as robots go, this is a sort of dumb robot, which is again why we thought we might be able to work with it, because we're not roboticists. Again, we're architects and designers, but basically any tool a designer can hack into and kind of work with in their way. And so here, you know, at the very beginning of the project, we're really just getting acquainted with the kinetics and the movement of the robot and what's possible. And Ragdale, being an artist foundation, invited several performers here, a movement artist, a dancer, Sarah Zalik, to come and interact with the robot and to live stream this as a performance. This was when they were not allowed to have any of their typical audience on the site. And so, you know, being able to create any sort of installation in the summer of 2020 was a hurdle, given that we weren't allowed to congregate on site and actually build something with a large team of fabricators. And then the second challenge was that the audience for the performance, the summer series of performances, was really distributed. They were at home and they were not able to come out. And so the main way that people were going to be viewing this project was through a live stream of aerial footage and drone footage. And so we worked with the Ragdale Foundation to make sure that that content was also free and available to the public, so that they could even, again, in a moment where things are locking down, actually maybe even expand their audience and offer this public programming to those who didn't have access to it before, again, much like these digital online video series that a lot of architecture schools are doing now, which is actually a really great resource for everyone.
So what you're looking at here is actually the only thing we submitted for the competition. So, I mean, this is one of those classic stories.
Not a drawing, it's
yeah,
a video.
we've entered this competition 3 different years and lost spectacularly. And then the first year that we didn't spend very much time on it at all is the year that things kind of fell into place. And I think the reason is that really we just submitted this animation. And so right from the jump, very much related to the last project we showed, the question was like, how does the drawing perform? And how can the drawing performance or the installation performance actually become an extension or part of the performance? So typically the architectural process on the site is kind of black boxed, and then there's a fabulous kind of opening, and it's just taken for granted that a lot of labor has happened on the site, a lot of processes have happened behind the scenes. But in this case, we thought a lot about the drawing performance, the performance of the drawing, excuse me, as being kind of integral.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So here you're seeing a shot from the second pattern, Drawing Fields 2, during an opening performance by this fabulous group of drummers from the Midwest improv drumming group. And I think that what this view really does is start to give you a kind of understanding of the kind of scale that we were able to work at, despite a very kind of modest investment in terms of project fee. Because another challenge, they had the dual challenge of not being able to bring people onto the site, and having limited audiences like you're seeing here. And then they also had the kind of financial burdens that came with a kind of difficult moment.
So temporary architecture is always plagued by several other kind of environmental issues. And so in a temporary pavilion or in a temporary stage, we were always kind of cautious about what would be left over, what would need to be discarded at the end of this. So we were, again, interested in this as a tool and as a process for making an architectural impact on an architectural scale, on the scale of a building or the scale of a landscape or the scale of a city block, as we'll show in our next project, but doing so without any waste. And so this is VOC-free, toxic-free, grass, environmental safe paint. It disappears when it's painted on grass in about 3 to 4 weeks. So, creates some kind of temporary excitement about the project and then naturally fades away. But the other thing that allowed us to do was come back several times and paint new and different patterns at each time.
And I think what you'll see back to back here actually is a little bit what Adam was talking about in terms of our kind of dual obsessions of the technology and then the kind of potential impact for things like creating landscapes for gathering. So on one side, you have the pattern here, establishing socially distanced safe zones for families. So essentially they were escorted onto the site. It was a limited audience, and it almost served as a kind of blanket, which is the kind of this gathering quilt where people could find these small voids and know that they were safely distanced from everyone else. But at the same time, here is the kind of telltale recursion pattern that you see in the Villa project. But here our interest in the recursion is thinking about, as Ashley was talking about before, the fact that the drone was a kind of extension of the audience. So this is a kind of unique moment where actually the drone wasn't seen as a kind of authoritative bird's eye view, but as an extension of vision, which is the way we think about it too, as this kind of augmentation of vision. And we have several of these kind of devices in our lives that are starting to extend our sensing. And so in this case, we're trying to use patterns that would amplify those effects. And of course, naturally, we use tools like Grasshopper to iterate through a number of patterns, looking at the payoff between a density pattern and the effect it produces. And then, of course, because these are ephemeral, this isn't drawing codes. It can't move effortlessly from amazing institution to the next. It is grounded on a particular site. It exists only for a limited amount of time. This is really all we have left of the drawing. And so scanning and documenting these things becomes very important to us. And we have a lot of questions about the status of exactly where the drawing is.
So as I mentioned, the great thing about this project was that it was a kind of a very experimental project and a learning tool for us. And so we were able to create 3 patterns over 4 months, each with very different kind of ambitions and things that we were testing, either the extents of the robot, what it was allowed to do, or the perception, or the color effects. And so in the last series, we explored color much more, looking at interlacing patterns and again, using the paint as a material, very few colors, but you can perceive more in multiple colors the further you zoom away from it. So the purple starts to appear when you zoom up, even though there's no purple paint on the ground. So again, just kind of working with aesthetics of vision.
And at a certain point, we realized that these things were kind of extra disciplinary in the sense that they weren't really drawings and they weren't really paintings. We're very interested in color. They're not paintings because they are, yes, produced horizontally like some paintings are, but they're also consumed horizontally, which is really not traditional for paintings. But also, even though they might have characteristics of drawings like line work, once you get close, you realize it is truly the materiality of painting, where we're depositing actually a tremendous volume, a very safe, but a tremendous volume of pigment on these sites. And I think that interest has continued to develop in this most recent drawing project, Cover the Grid, or drawing and/or painting project.
So we were asked to participate in the Chicago Architecture Biennale this year with the artistic director, David Brown, who wanted to move the projects and the exhibition out of the Chicago Cultural Center, which is right downtown, and move it out into various neighborhoods in the city so that the projects would have a more lasting impact on underserved neighborhoods and communities in Chicago. And so we had this wonderful site in North Lawndale. It's the, well, you'll see it's the kind of empty asphalt lot there. It looks empty on this, but we'll kind of talk about how it wasn't really empty when we got there. But we had this site, which is right by one of the elevated train lines also. And so, one of the first things we did was attend a block party of, there's a local church group that uses this.
Best site visit ever.
Yeah, that uses this site every Wednesday night for a block party. People walk through and cut through the lot all day long to get to work, to get to the store, wherever they're going. And people play basketball on the court all throughout different times of the day, day and weekend. And so this was a really active and loved and historic site in the neighborhood already. And so, we were really privileged to come in and work with many local groups, including the Open Architecture, the Freedom House Studios, and the Firehouse, as well as several other architects who were working in and around this site, and really talk to the people and see, what they kind of wanted for the future of this lot.
And we considered our work, as Ashley said, the site's been used for 30 years by the community as an incredible legacy, and that's only going to continue. There's a lot of long-term investment in doing more permanent things on the site. So ours was a kind of moment to pause and not project the future, but consider a possible future. And we considered it a way to kind of prototype how the site would be used eventually, because our pattern will disappear after a few months. And we hope that the legacy is the lessons learned about how to use the site, the way that the community has embraced some areas and challenged others, and also just a kind of a legacy for continuing the momentum that these organizations have already set the kind of groundwork for.
Yeah, so there were a couple of things that we were looking at as far as thinking about the way that we wanted color and form to operate on the site. And there were a couple of calibration tools, the cyanometer in the bottom right, or the photographer's color calibration in the upper right image you see. And these were inspirations for us because they really kind of took that moment of pause a bit further, and the moment of sort of surveying a particular environment to take some kind of stock of what it needs to be, and how we could best reflect the desires of the community.
So I wasn't familiar with the cyanometer, but it's an amazing little device developed by Alexander von Humboldt. And the principle is that you can hold this little circle up to the horizon and spin it to determine the quality of the atmosphere. Of course, before we had like spectrometers and things like that. But I think it's really marvelous to think about how color isn't just a kind of like arbitrary or stylistic choice, but can actually become something that relates to atmospheric effects. And that's something we'll talk about at the end of the project as well.
So we also were working with a local high school group who was looking at several different sites over this past summer, working with some local designers to think about the future of this site and others in the North Lawndale community. So some things that we talked about with them were the way that the site has been used and how they wanted it to be used. So again, the basketball court being a really important thing. A bounce house is often brought and set up again about once a week. Somebody will set up a bounce house. Double Dutch and Foursquare were favorite games of the kids, as well as hopscotch, which they begged us to include, and we did include in the final. And so the other thing we talked to them, and this is one of their sketches. So we presented the design to them. They showed us our sketches. We were actually very excited about how much they sort of already overlapped, even in our very first meeting. They were really interested in the checkers board, and they were interested in throwback 90s colors, as they described it. And so we were really excited to kind of put these aesthetics, along with the things that we had been looking at into the project.
Yeah, we found ourselves like very quickly speaking the same language, but they were also like super tough critics, which was awesome. Like they were good clients in the sense that they challenged a lot of our preconceptions, which like had to happen because again, like our perspective on the site was so limited based on our experience. So one of the things they pointed out very early on was that the basketball court for them was the community asset, and so was the Pink Line. It's an underserved community for a number of reasons, but I think that like one of the things that they take a lot of pride in is like there is like a really strong transit system that comes out to their site that brings people out, and it really connects them to the rest of the city. So we worked a lot with actually featuring the basketball court more than anything else and making it an icon that was almost instantly recognizable from the track. So a lot of this too is a question about how this design participates with the existing context. So things like this amazing kind of collision of the pattern with this existing pole, but also questions of like how the site rewards attention in different durations. There's people on the train sweeping by really quickly who might notice, hey, there's something going on at the Waca site. But more important, our audience was the people that spend every Wednesday night on this site, or even more. The other thing that was great is that like halfway through the process, there was a block party. So you can see here the mural, it's kind of unfinished. And we got to come out and watch people use it, talk to them about it. The kids got excited about what was going in, they considered the right direction. We got a few more pointers during this party. And here you can see Shaheen Rudbari, one of the fabulous collaborators who worked with Jermaine Barnes on a structure on the site, this amazing bounce castle, kind of posting up on this kid who is in a cast and flip-flops and still, apologies to Shaheen, but this kid killed him. So here's the installation sequence. So one of the things that, the reason that this took on more characteristics of a painting is that we knew that there were going to be people on the site all the time, and we needed a certain intensity and saturation of color that we didn't need to achieve, nor was there an interest in the previous project. So what actually happened is the robot did all the kind of basic geometry, and then we came in and filled in the site. And you can see that from above, it has like these interesting kind of calibration patterns, but on the ground, it's actually a modular system that complements some of the furniture that the students developed for on the site that we'll show a couple of pictures of briefly here. And then it also begins to take on elements from the context. So what looks like above as this calibration strip actually takes on the same scale as a crosswalk that's nearby and matches some of the abstract pattern systems like the Foursquare that are already in the urban environment, and exaggerates them. So here's some of that furniture.
And here we talked to the high school students a lot about, the future of the site. And so we really encouraged them, and this was just, kind of happened spontaneously on the site, but we had talked to the high school students, we had encouraged them to use the site for a few months. And then if they didn't, if there was something about it they wanted to change, we invited them to come and paint over it, add on to it, manipulate it. Like really, it was a kind of moment of the site, but it wasn't the end all future of the site, right? It was just a kind of snapshot that again would be transformed by the community, because we're in Columbus, and so we've sort of, it's there and it's being used and changed every day, and that's exactly what should be happening. So we were really excited about that, and so we really got into also, just looking at the paint as a material. We're used to bigger, harder, thicker materials as architects, but we had to, start getting very specific and think about, each paint color weighs quite a bit different in the bucket. So like there's already this kind of physicality to understanding what a different color means. And really the way we used color on the site was to exactly kind of highlight the existing, so that anyone coming onto the site, again, there was some color, some spot of color on their t-shirt that was pink or red or yellow or blue, that again is picking up the context, so that everything kind of falls into place and everything belongs to the composition. It's not a kind of, here's the new composition and here's the existing context, but actually we're hoping everything could blend together much more.
Yeah, a lot of our compositional studies, I think there's a kind of emphasis on a certain openness. And the question was, how could we perform that with color? And so as Ashley's talking about, we didn't want to inscribe the site with one color and say this is one zone and the kind of surrounding area is another, but instead thinking about a kind of full spectrum of colors that would begin to bring new life to things off the site and on the site. Again, this idea of a calibration pattern that allows you to kind of absorb the environment in new ways. Color also is not an arbitrary choice, particularly in an urban environment. So there's an extraordinary amount of concern about heat offset from blacktops. There's a movement, of course, to paint the roofs of buildings white. And so we actually had a thermal scan done of the site. And so I approached a few different drone operators, and they said that this was a folly and that there was no point in scanning it because you would need something that would register and produce a heat signature that was distinct, like a person. And they kept arguing with me that the color would be kind of a very minor change. But they did assure me that they could get up to 0.1 degrees of difference legibility. So they scanned it, but the difference was 15 degrees between the black areas and the white areas, an extraordinary thing. And I think that, now that we've done this, I think that it's again, maybe a turn for us to think again, even more about color as not only a kind of stylistic or arbitrary choice, but a real material thing, a thing that has extraction implications and also atmospheric. So we're going to show a few quick clips here that just kind of capture for us what is the kind of, at this point, important legacy image of the project, which is this notion of if the previous Biennale was really focused on Chicago proper and the downtown, this is about connecting to these areas such as Lawndale and the Pilsen neighborhood, for example, where we'll be next week for another painting on grass. So this is the last shot, but you can see that what's really interesting is like watching and returning to the site multiple times a day and watching the registration of color change. We've done a series of photographs that we're going to use the site almost as a color card and think a little bit more about what it's doing to the atmosphere around it. But it's been really great to see the community kind of embrace it, and we're most fond for its temporality, knowing that its legacy is assured in terms of excitement and use for the site and a certain kind of way to tell a new story about it. But in terms of its built legacy, it's quite light, and with some sun, wind, and rain, it'll be gone. So yeah, I'm going to go quickly through this next project, but we also want to include another project that was a little bit earlier that's about gathering and also has a distinct attitude toward drawing. So this is our environment for becoming digital, this fantastic conference that colleagues at Michigan put together. And our work at Outpost Office was to create an environment for this series. And what was interesting about it is that it had a lot of programmatic malleability. So there were going to be presentations, is what you see here, but there were also going to be workshops, and also it was going to become the furniture that functioned as the furniture for this commons area at the school. So there's this incredible kind of atrium void space that had been created, but to bring life to it, we decided to use this exaggerated scale furniture system, which would create objects that almost created their own social scales. So when you look at these things, about 5 people can sit on them. About 2 people can gather in their center. It takes about 3 people to move them. They create a kind of certain social unit. So like a chair is an icon of individuality and a kind of assignment of one person to one object. Whereas in these cases, there's an ambiguity formally to them, and there's also a kind of socialization kind of baked into them, because you literally can't move them by yourself. And they do invite a lot of different scenarios. So this is actually like probably the only drawing we did for the project. Is that right? Very, very quick.
Probably, yeah.
And the spirit of this drawing is to take these very, very platonic, simple things, because we couldn't afford to fabricate something that complicated, and turn them into misfits, essentially finding a way to create a system that had some traces of modularity, but didn't suggest distinct ways that the parts could fit together. So this kind of catalog of misfits, as you see them in these videos, we clearly love the drone, as you see them in these videos, the patterns begin to snap into one another at very specific moments, working in this very digital grammar of just fill, line, stroke, and even the abstraction of taking what was a very material finish on these SIPS panels and polishing it down till it felt as virtual as we could get it, with many layers of lacquer to make it safe, but also to kind of produce this kind of this image. And so you can see people gathering on them here. They're fabricated from, of course, SIPS panels, so OSB sandwiches with foam in the center, which made them just sturdy enough to take the load of a lot of people, and it could absorb a lot of cantilevering and cut down on fabrication time, because basically the SIPs arrived in a truck and we were done, except for finishing.
I wish.
Except for finishing. I'm glossing over, pun intended, a very hard process. But you can see here that actually, they become quite stable, but they're also light enough to stack in small groups, as I was mentioning.
And this was important because, again, this was at an educational institution at the University of Michigan. And we were really interested in how you create a public event without a front row and a back row. So how you kind of create an equal space for both students and faculty. So in these images, you'll see kind of students and faculty all sprinkled throughout. The crowd is really mixed up. People could kind of find, a space that suited their mood at the moment. But really, it was a kind of non-hierarchical way of sitting, right?
And this is my favorite image from the project, because really what it came down to was ways that students would improvise how to use the furniture. So you could plan as much as you wanted, but they would do amazing things, like in this workshop, the single student sitting in the center of the donut with this offset to create his perfect kind of workstation and cubicle, while his colleagues are around the perimeter. And so again, like we did more drawing after this project than during it, because we basically just issued the shapes to cut. And so these are post-occupancy drawings that are, again, like trying to understand how people use the space. And we like these kind of objects where there's a kind of alienation from the normative, and they are not interpreted as furniture, but as like almost like interior landscapes or kind of other characters in the scene. It's not to develop necessarily kind of an empathy with them, but we like the idea. For us, program is as simple as a surface that has a specific slope. We really have a lot of confidence in users kind of finding ways to do things. And we have a lot of hesitancy about investing too much thinking into expecting how people are going to use things, because it always changes. And the kind of closing piece on this is just a kind of reflection on our kind of obsession with taking things off the shelf and then putting new possibilities into the catalog. So here are all the pieces after they arrived at Michigan. Now that I'm looking at them, I'm reminded by Ashley how much work it took to finish these. But a few months after we finished the project, we went on the website for the manufacturer, and we found that our project had become a case study. So here, amongst like all these kind of residential and commercial projects, often which suppress the expression of the really interesting, innovative project or innovative material that's inside them, is our little project that has a kind of 1% budget. Like we're the 1% art budget here. But we found a way to kind of get back into the catalog and push out new possibilities for the project. And that just kind of really excited us.
And so the other, as I mentioned, the platforms for gathering, which we've just talked about, several projects that fall into that. The other type of work that we're currently doing in our office, and we like to switch between different types of work in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year.
So an hour.
Yeah, in an hour sometimes if you're Erik, but kind of jumping in and out of
Too honest.
jumping in and out of different projects and workflow, and also in our teaching, of course, that's the benefit of practicing and teaching as well. So I'm currently teaching a studio about this topic, which I'll talk about now. But after a single family has also been a kind of interest in us, and that's just another way to talk about housing in America. So when we think about housing in America currently, and I feel really I'm preaching to the choir at CCA. You have between Keith and Niraj and many other amazing faculty whose research I look at quite a bit when I'm working on this project. But there are no two words in America, I think, that have influenced our housing system as much as the words single and family. And so recently I've been kind of looking and digging into that idea. And so the first project that we did collaboratively looking at this was called Safety Not Guaranteed, and was really looking at suburbia as a defensive typology. And so looking at the formation of historic cities, always as a kind of concentric ring, or had some structure and typology around defense, and looking how contemporary suburbia in America often uses some of those same formal moves. And then sort of speculating, this is incredibly kind of speculative, almost satirical project of kind of playing that out and seeing where that would go, just to, again, kind of understand what these underlying and embedded issues were in suburbia today. And so using the kind of forms and techniques and colors even of suburbia, so the pink and the brown kind of brick, the pitched roofs, but doing it through aggregation and doing it through really intense sectional moves here to really, again, think about the implications of our fortified suburbia.
And so the project became a kind of a combination of a kind of examination of physical features, but also a kind of deeper exploration into kind of paranoia as a kind of recurring theme in the kind of, I guess, kind of suburban mentality.
Yeah, and what happens when that paranoia is allowed to run rampant, say, and even in the representation, again, for this project, experimenting with, we build a lot of physical models, but here experimenting with a type of physical model that was actually based on a military type of modeling, which is called the sand table. And so sand tables are commonly used in military strategy, even still used today, because they're really good at helping people understand spatial awareness and spatial strategy for an attack or something. And so this was a kind of sandcastle sand table for an exhibition about this project. So there's the kind of whimsy that Adam was taking when we're taking a very serious project and then always kind of trying to, acknowledge the satire in it, I suppose.
Yeah, and so to conclude the lecture, we're going to start with something else that was deferred by 18 months, which was a show at Wedge Gallery. But what was really lovely about this is just like we found with you guys at CCA, moving from posters into the magazine, we were able to take our budget for shipping and move it into an app. And so this project concludes with a drawing experiment. So we thought it'd be a good place to kind of land the talk. So, you know, if we've mentioned a few times this question of like, where is the drawing in the project and where is it being instrumentalized? And I'm showing here just a few studies of kind of false starts or branches not taken yet of a series of studies that we worked on very intensively a few years ago on this question of different models of collectivity using the principles of digital composition. So things like recursion you can see here. Here you can see aggregation mixed with primitives. And in each and every project we were looking at, we were trying to think carefully about, really always in the back of our minds, even though these were kind of extremely speculative, extremely formal studies, in the back of our mind was still always that question of the registration of these things as architectural projects. You know, we talked with Clark Tenhouse yesterday about the presentation we did of the drawing codes drawings, and he had a lot of questions about, you know, how you would instrumentalize these things. And so some things, you know, are more easily facades, some things are more easily plans. And for us, these collective experiments were always about housing in one way or another. One way or another, they were about a kind of negotiation of the individual and redefining questions of the collective through a kind of formal proposition, but then like chasing that the architectural implications of that. So this is the final set of studies for this project we call the Longhouse, which is a speculative project for densifying suburban and ex-urban sites. So essentially a system you can use to populate incongruent sites with a kind of low resolution and low level of construction that houses multiple families. And maybe Ashley, you could elaborate a little bit more on the agenda behind it.
Yeah, and so when we think about the research we've been doing on the single family, Jermaine Barnes and Shaheen Rubari, who, as we mentioned in the Chicago Architecture Biennale project, shared a site with us and designed a bounce house. But they also guest edited this mass context edition, the latest one called Vigilantism. They were looking at vigilantism as a kind of predominant or possible way of understanding architecture in America. And so I was really interested in, again, in this idea of kind of defense in the single family, but this time instead of a kind of formal exploration, I was looking more at zoning. So if we take those terms single and family, they are given definitions in zoning code. So just imagine the zoning, your city's zoning code defining what a family is, right? And that is true. That is what zoning codes actually do. They give definitions for families. But when we say that out loud, suddenly we sort of realize all of the pitfalls and the downfalls of that, right? In America today, 4 out of 5 households are not a nuclear family in that they're 2 parents married with children. So that's only 1 out of 5 households today. And so we're really interested in that 4 out of 5, which I think has been the kind of overlooked majority in some ways, right? All of the different ways that families exist today and should be celebrated and kind of understood. And so we were interested in this typology for domestic sharing, the Longhouse, which created units of all different types, exterior spaces and interior spaces of all different shapes and sizes, again, to kind of reflect the way that a family might change, grow, shrink over time, and just the way, again, kind of reflect the way families are actually combined, including things like chosen families and extended family units. And even during quarantine, the kind of idea of the quarantine pod was another type of kinship structure. And so what are all the types of kinship structures that, again, are actually much more common than this kind of mythical idea of the nuclear family?
Yeah, and as a speculative project, we're really appreciative of the space given to us by Wedge Gallery to work on this, but the project is still kind of evolving. But basically this idea is that there's not a kind of one-to-one in terms of the formalization of the exterior and the interior, it's a little hard to track how many units are exactly inside, and we like that kind of ambiguity. The lower levels are a series of chambers that are separated by these service spaces that offer access to the top. And then the upper level is a much more kind of open space that can be used for things like home offices, daycare, and the address or connection between the units, like the tops are accessible from multiple units. So there's this idea that the top is a much more kind of shared territory, while things are much more kind of parceled at the bottom, although the infrastructure is relatively flexible. And then there's generous exterior spaces and features like small courtyards that are tucked into it. And so the proposal, again, is not a singular building design. It's a flexible prototype for densifying. And the geometry destabilizes normative notions of boundary and offers these kind of semi-attached conditions. So you can see there's a lot of like semi-conditioned spaces, conditioned spaces, very large open spaces at the top, modular units at the bottom. And so the model took on the qualities as well in terms of being something that's a little bit kind of loose and easy and rapidly assembled, because we wanted the model to feel like at any point it could kind of collapse and go become like another shape. And so the kind of crudeness of the construction is purposeful, one, flat packing so that we could afford to get this thing out to California, but then secondarily, again, to create this idea that the system is kind of frozen in this particular moment with a little bit of precarity.
Mhm.
And so you can see that, again, these like folds and clumps and crimps, these nooks and crannies become kind of spaces that allow us to negotiate between the different units.
And the use of the fluorescent here, I think, again, goes back to some things that we were wondering about: the drawing, the model. Where is the drawing? What is the drawing? You know, we were interested in this drawing, I mean, this model appearing like a drawing, right? So there are kind of aspects of flatness, even though it's a incredibly formally complex or somewhat formally, seems more complex than it actually is, I think, from the elevation. But we were interested in that elevation moment where the difference between the OSB texture and the fluorescent striping or polychromy flattens out the image and creates that kind of drawing effect.
We also have like a lighting scheme here that takes the skylight that runs the length of the project and reduces the project to the kind of graphic gesture that makes it, which is the singular fold. So when we went online, we suddenly had this excess budget, and like all good architects, instead of monetizing our work, we just decided to spend the money on something else. And so we actually produced this drawing app. And I think that the project felt a little incomplete without the app. And the app is kind of essential because what the app does is that it basically helps us extend the idea that, again, this is not a singular design, but it's a kind of a proposal for a certain type of working. And so it takes this very rudimentary, almost like soloist process of simply taking a piece and folding it a number of times. And you can produce, using this website, which it actually works on your phone after a lot of difficulty, to produce your own Longhouse propositions. And so people could come to the wedge show, learn more about this question of single family that we're visiting, learn more about the kind of areas we're trying to focus our research on, and building a kind of awareness about something that may not look normal, actually filling the gaps for what is normal, as Ashley mentioned, 4 out of 5 families, where the kinship structure is different, the size of the family fluctuates and is different, and communal living models might be different. And so that kind of concludes the talk. We wanted to end it there. We hope that all the students get to on the app and just play around a little bit.
Yeah, go to the app.
Yeah.
It's more fun than listening to us talk, for sure.
Yeah, and I think we went a little longer than expected, but thank you guys so much for your
Yeah, thank you.
attention. And
we
yeah,
can
thanks
take
again
any
for having us.
questions
Yeah,
or
yeah.
anything.
You're not off the hook yet.
We're not going
We're
anywhere.
not gonna, yeah.
Don't disappear into the virtual ether. Thank you so much. This was really an incredible lecture, and I think a great way to celebrate the Drawing Code show and really, I think, beautifully demonstrate like how drawing is, in fact, like I guess for me, I would say the fundamental generative act in architecture. And I just loaded up your website and made my own little long house.
Send it to us, please.
Send us a picture.
Yeah.
Very excited about. But I'm hoping you two will be willing to entertain some questions.
Of course, of course.
And Adam, I think you might want to jump in here too as the initiator, one of the initiators of the Drawing Codes project, and maybe there's some conversation that's fruitful from your perspective. I will say, anyone in the audience, feel free to chat your question, or maybe we can stop screen sharing so we can see
we'll do that.
folks. And Malia, maybe we can see everyone. Is that possible? I know I can. I just did it.
Give me one sec.
So feel free to raise your virtual hand or put a question in the chat. Or suffer the consequences of letting Adam or I toss a question at Erik and Ashley, which could be very inside baseball if I'm have any architectural awareness at all.
Well, I wanted to give space for other people to ask questions, but if no one's going to jump in, then I will. Thank you guys for the talk. I guess, you know, maybe to pick up on a little bit on the conversation on Monday, and which you talked about a little bit in the talk today, this question of like value and assessment that Clark raised on Monday, and the translation of these kind of generative acts of drawing, as Keith put it, or the kind of computational sketches that are common through all the projects. And, you know, this is something that I've, you know, like struggle and kind of grind through in my own work too, in a productive way. But I'm just curious, like how do you navigate that process of translating from the kind of computational sketch to something that is, let's say, architectural, spatial, programmatic? And is it as simple as like stopping and, you know, kind of moving to a different medium of like figuring out plans and sections, or are there other layers and processes that you kind of build into it? And that's a really big question, but take it wherever you like.
I feel like we set limits. I'm going to ask Erik a question because I'm trying to think, but I feel like we set limits that are so that we don't just have to choose a stopping point. Like there's something embedded in the idea already that suggests the stopping point already. Like the Longhouse, if I gave the Longhouse as an example, like there are only so many folds that are allowed to happen, because after a certain number of folds, the program doesn't work, or the form breaks down, or the other things about the original ideas start to fall apart, right? So it's never like we don't allow it to get to a point, or we allow it to get to the point and we just pull it back very quickly, maybe. Or with the Villa Rotunda drawing, you can go on forever. We were limited by the printer and the size of the paper, right? So like you guys gave us the rules for that one.
Yeah.
And that if it's going to be 24 inches by 24 inches, I think is what it is. There's only, Erik wanted to go 2 more times down. You know, he wanted to keep going. But then you do a test print and it's like, yeah, nobody can read that. And in fact, the printer can't plot that. So I think that's where being confronted with some sort of physical,
Right.
That's why we build a lot of models physically, possibly too, is that forces you to simplify something in a way that, you know, we're never 3D printing models. So we're always doing something that can be constructed physically.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think we sandbox a lot. So we just like test this stuff and we might revisit it. I think part of it is, so there's like a simple kind of compositional answer. One is that like I was actually talking with my fellow Hans Tersak about this when we had our opening, and we were looking around at all the models that I had in this another digital cabinet, and Ashley and I were talking to him about the formation of them, and I just made some stupid comment about like I try to make the compositions idiot proof, me being the idiot, because like the question is like, can we create something like the Longhouse system where like even if you break it, it produces something interesting? And we can have a conversation amongst architects if we really want to about like what's a good fold and a bad fold. But when it comes down to it, we like these things that are like so dumb. They kind of,
You can describe it in one sentence.
you can describe one sentence and it doesn't have failures. Like there's no, like, we're not precious about it. There's no like elegance or very specific aesthetic effect, for better or for worse, that we're not trying to achieve. But the other thing is that I think when we finish it, that it doesn't disclose its process. That's always the thing. It's like it has to produce something extra from the process. And it's like we were talking about in the discussion, the idea that someone brought up, I can't remember, it may have been Keith, about like generation analysis are two very different processes. And like the mistake you can make is thinking that, as like some of these early 1960s artists I studied actually from Germany, they associated analysis as just generation backwards and vice versa. And the problem is that you can't leave the code of the things becoming in it, because you need to produce a certain uncanniness. So we do like look for things that don't disclose how they were made. And then when you see how they're made, they tell you certain things. So that has to be a quality too. It's not enough that it shows how it was made. In fact, it should supersede that in some way. So I guess there is a kind of calculation. But the other thing is like deferring how useful something might be. Like doing something like Campo Marzio and not trying to make it a spatial project yet, but deferring that and learning later that the lesson was that it's about drawing as a performance and transposing that into new work. So like yesterday when Clark was talking to us about the drawings, I was thinking more about this question of spatialization. I didn't argue this at the time, but like, you know, our colleague Curtis Roth would probably argue that actually like the most interesting spatialization of those drawings is the distributed character of like all the people that were working on them. And so maybe that's the lesson, right? And so I think that in some ways, like producing work that takes on these tools and produces something crude enough that you can find the legibility, like lets a lot of different audiences in, and like maybe someone else can find usefulness in it that you didn't. But Clark's question was so good, and we've been rehearsing like and talking about it since. I think it's like the fundamental question. I think it does shape like the practice, you know, the way you do that, because a lot of practices use the same tools and do this kind of sandboxing. But I would give those two answers. One is like a formalization thing, and one is like, I think we're learning more and more to just defer the usefulness. Like just maybe it was an experiment, you know?
Yeah, and that it's someone else was talking about this recently, like it's okay to make a lot of mistakes. I mean, that has taken a long time to come around to like really embrace the mistake. Like we do things a lot of time with no idea about a future exhibition, no idea about a future whatever.
Yeah.
Like we just try something just to try it. And a lot of that stuff is, you know, we never show to anybody.
It's
of course,
horrifying.
that, you know, but that's the point, actually. That's the point of design.
Yeah. It's nice to see that Charles is here. I really appreciate that comment.
Hi, Charles. Great to see
Charles.
you again.
Yeah, it really means a lot that you're here.
He's in the photos probably of the Michigan project, which is why he's LOLing.
Yeah.
But this is a good question from Eric
okay.
also. If you want us to just read the questions.
Unfortunately, I missed the drawing code workshops. He's in Australia, which we just learned. Where's a good place to start learning and experimenting with generative algorithmic drawings and processes? So there's a lot of resources I used. Adam would probably answer this a lot better than I would, because I consider myself one of the worst programmers that teaches programming. But I learned a lot with simple things like the Python primer, which I think does a really good job of like naturalizing it for architects, in the sense that Python as a language is high level, which sounds intimidating until you realize high level is like, it's very far from abstraction. It's something that's like natural language. So we talked in the workshop about pseudocodes, the idea that like a Solowit drawing is a series of explicit instructions. And I think Python naturalizes, especially with the Python scripting, naturalizes those into Rhino commands that students are familiar with. So like, I think I would start there, because then it also like, it's kind of a set of exercises that are immediately about visualization in space in some way or another. That's too kind to keep. I'll take it.
By best, you mean the only.
I just wanted to make you laugh, Eric.
You've done it. You've done it. Yeah, no, I talked to the students a lot about this though. Like, I like the idea of like educating Charles was there for this too, like this idea of like a digital generalists, right? People that are like equipped enough to be dangerous, but don't disappear down the rabbit hole and maintain maybe like a healthy skepticism of the technology. And also like just naturalizing ourselves a little bit digitally. So I'm not a coder that does architecture. I'm an architect that does coding.
Charles just dropped a long comment. By the way, hi, Charles.
So Charles is asking, seen the Ragdale work a couple times before, but seeing it this time, I had this association with photos of pivot irrigation systems taken from the sky. So someone's been looking at taking measures across the American landscape,
yes.
maybe.
Yeah.
The Corner McLean book, which
right.
is so great. Not a question, but interesting to think about reading a series of logistics of the sky, a
Right.
natural occurring phenomenon. Seems analogical, easy for me to say, to Ragdale stuff. Yeah, I think that's totally true. So we think a lot about, and actually we had a really beautiful interview with Sarah Herta for the new edition of New City, where she just asked us some pretty frank questions about like working in the Midwest. And so one of the things that's super cool about working at Ohio State is we have access to an area called Waterman Farm. It's an agricultural research outpost where we rent a couple acres for about $150 of research money for a month, and we paint on it. And so it's really amazing to have that landscape, and it puts us right next to a number of productive landscapes. So people working, on things much more important than what we're working on, like how to grow things through droughts and things like that. But we have found ourselves like spending a lot more time examining ways that landscape is broken up. And when we drive into Chicago, like there's this almost infinite horizon of just like wind turbines and like a lot of nothing until you're very, very close to the city. And it's really striking to understand all the landscapes that are necessary to support all that urbanization. And we have a real interest in visiting those as precedents because they are incredible space making strategies, but they also speak to a landscape that, being from Tennessee and Ashley's from a farming community, we're quite familiar with.
Or crop circles.
That's the plains. Okay, now I can speak with more expertise.
People ask us about crop circles as well. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
because our precedents, as I was saying, like they're extra painting and they're extra drawing. So it's
Which
like we look at land art, we look at
Yeah.
Corner McLean a lot. We love
Right.
taking measures across the American landscape.
Yeah, but not until recently, like, we've always enjoyed those things, as most architects do, but like now we have like a project that can really be informed by those ideas, which is nice.
I'm going to put a link to the book.
Taking measures across the American landscape.
Yeah.
I want to return to this notion of the incomplete in your response to Adam's question. I think there's something really generous in the notion of not wrapping something up so perfectly and definitively. Because I do see in the work, which I find really exciting, and I find particularly exciting for architects of your generation, that there is a kind of openness to what you put out in the world, and that you're kind of seeding thought, you're seeding action in the way that you deliver the work. And maybe refuse is too strong a word, but kind of refuse to, button it up, so to speak. And you kind of clearly spoke to intentionality around that, but it seems to me like the intentionality might be, in the way you spoke about it, more for your own future actions. But how do you see the work in dialogue with other work that we see happening today, and how might you feel about the threads being picked up by others and run with? Because I do in fact see it existing in the world that way, really, as kind of offerings to architecture. And I think with the housing stuff, which of course I'm totally down with, beyond architecture, offerings to other ways we might conceive of being and being in relation to others in the world.
Yeah, I hope we're giving as much as we're getting, and I think we'll always be getting more than we're giving, but it's nice to think that we're also giving, I think, to architects, to the conversation, right? To the conversation among architects, but also like on bigger, broader, issues. So, I mean, that's wonderful, but I think the question was something slightly different.
No, I mean, I think that it's funny that I really like the way that you've put that. And I think we are trying to be more intentional about the fact that we work with a certain openness as a kind of always a strategy in the work. I mean, part of that is, again, like a hesitancy or a deferment of like trying to have too much control. And that comes from like a programming perspective. And then the openness in terms of like, it's funny, like one of the first things we did together was another digital project, which like took the form of a cabinet. It was just like a big database. And it was like, here's some stuff. And like, we've been pulling from the shelves of that for a long time. And I feel like it's nice to think of like that as a kind of pool that anyone can pull from. But I like the way you've put that, because I think that it's a very nice reading of it. And I think we try to do it, but also there is anxiety about like, maybe we should just get this like just right. And like there is a way of working, a looseness to the way we work. And I think that we talk a little bit about like a nonchalantness, like we're really serious about this work.
Yeah.
And I think that the disposition of openness shouldn't come with an idea of like us not caring. And I think that we are intentional about being open. And so threading that needle and communicating that is important, because otherwise it comes across very differently.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm
well,
answering the question, because I'm so appreciative of the reading.
Yeah.
But I do think it's there, and I do think we're trying to be more intentional about it. And like the Bell Park project we showed for the Biennale was a place where we have to do that. Like we have to like do something and get out of the way as quickly as we possibly can. And we thought a lot about these kind of default patterns, because we like there's so much in the world that's already like completely beautiful and already designed. And so it's more about like reformatting that, re-instrumentalizing that, and finding ways again to like misuse and misappropriate things to give them new potency. So just like Ashley was saying, we get as much as we use. And so like, I like the idea of like rehearsing that openness, not only what we produce, but also like the way we produce it.
And I also appreciate the like generational aspect that you're bringing up, because I think we're always going to have a reaction to how we were taught. And so, each generation is having the chain reaction. And so if we were taught that everything is so precious and so serious, and Palladio is not to be touched, and Campo Marzio can never be disturbed, and these things are so precious at the
Not by me.
We're no, not by you, not by you at all. You were up there cutting up suburbia and pasting it together at Yale, and we were like, oh, I want to be doing that over there. That looks more fun. But there were these and I think we less in grad school and probably more in undergrad, when you're slightly more impressionable. But there's this kind of seriousness, which I think is very important for the discipline, because what we're doing is serious. But there's a kind of heaviness also. And so we're interested in the seriousness, but not the heaviness. Like we don't need to be burdened with everything. And I think that's our own way of trying to make the discipline more inclusive in all sorts of ways. And we try to bring that into the office. So when we have employees, or we have assistants are working with us, or students working with us, like we are trying to work on that kind of office attitude of a serious but kind of nonchalant attitude of like, it's okay to work on something for 8 hours, and at the end of the day we all decide we didn't like it. Like that's okay. So, we're not concerned about the time and money issue.
I also do think that like there's people generationally that are really important to us. Like I think that like we both study with Keller at Yale, and I think that like I don't know if you would recognize a lot of what Keller taught us in this work, but I do think for us Keller was a source of understanding that it wasn't about the preciousness of the object necessarily. It wasn't the object itself. It was like how it was absorbed into the world. And so
the media
and that to us is like an incredible lesson. So I think we do try to sidestep making things too precious. Maybe we don't internalize or reflect as many of the lessons that we should have learned, but maybe we just didn't learn them. But for us, it really is about like, the thing can't be too precious, because we're not interested in the thing, we're interested in its effects. And maybe the
idea behind the thing.
Yeah. And so maybe the thing can be relatively incomplete, it can be a little nonchalant, it can be a little disheveled, and it can still do enough of the work.
I really appreciate also the the thoughtfulness and the kind of clear understanding that I'm getting from the two of you in how much you reflect upon what you do. That it seems to me there's probably as much conversation about the things you're making as there is making the things you're making. And of course, I know that a bit because I know the two of you somewhat well. After this lecture, not as well as I would like, because I would like to sort of be a fly on the wall in the studio to see how some of that plays out. And maybe when the smiles are not on your faces and there's like,
careful what you wish for.
yeah, no, I know, right? Like you never want to actually see inside somebody else's partnership. But you kind of want to at the same time, right?
Yeah,
So how the hell is that shit happening?
We'll add you to our group text chain.
Yes.
That's where all the work gets done.
It livens up mostly around meetings, but yeah, it's insightful.
But I think it's such a valuable lesson. I think particularly to young architects, our students that are still on the call, that we all really understand to be young architects, young colleagues of ours, to sort of see that. Yeah, the kind of, sitting back and thinking about and discussing and looking at and turning over like these things that we make, because we start with, sometimes we don't start with, we might start with intentions that are totally gone by the time we get down the road on the project. But the work actually speaks back to us. And what I really love about what we saw tonight is seeing, in fact, how the things that we make, the things that you made, communicate with you as the makers. And it's really what I think, makes what we do so valuable beyond ourselves, but also enriching for ourselves. So if there are not any other questions, I think we can release you to 921 Ohio. No, maybe it's 821 in Ohio. 921. I keep forgetting Ohio's further east than I imagine.
Keith, before we go, Jeanette, did you have a question? I see you waving.
I do.
Sorry.
To stop you being able to move on.
You're good.
Sorry, I'm distracted right now. I really enjoy your work. I'm so inspired by this. Thank you so much. I find your work so it's so strange, but it's so inviting, and I just think that's fantastic. I had a question that was related to Keith's comment, or a question about sort of what you connect to, or kind of what your context is. And I was thinking about the ways in which you related to like heat maps, or the concept of a single family home. And I think there are certain references and kind of moments of intersection between, let's say, other modes of analysis and the ways that you're working. So I'm curious to hear about your thoughts about like how you translate between those different kinds of even forms of visualization or techniques of analysis. So maybe the heat map would be one example, or if you have any other thoughts about where you find those translations most difficult or most sort of satisfying, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, the boring / fascinating answer from me is the budget, which seems like such a huge part of work in general, which is never discussed in a lecture format. In a way that like we maybe talked about it in terms of logistics, right? And so like the kind of logistics of the idea that we're going to build a giant model just to flat pack it and ship it across the US, for example, right? So the design of the thing there had to kind of absorb that, or we had to choose a kind of logistical method that would work with the design in some way and the performance of the thing in the world, right? We were going to take it across the country and set it up in various states. We're going to stop every day and, assemble and disassemble the thing, right? So like it was going to be a kind of performance. So, that's one. And then there's the kind of logistical spreadsheet, which I think is like in some ways as important as the thermal gain and the thermal heat, right? Because with X amount more or less, it's a completely different project.
Mhm.
And that might seem abstract or even kind of boring, but I think it's the reality. And again, it's just another rule that we embrace. Like, we don't complain about, oh, it's a small budget, like everything's a small budget. Like, nobody ever says, oh, I have a great budget. Like, nobody has ever said I have too much money in this architectural budget. So we don't, it's not about, saying that the budgets are too small. It's just about like using that as another parameter kind of, that at least, I don't know, I find sort of fun and like a fun challenge sometimes.
Yeah, no, I love the question, and it's really generous, and we're inspired by you likewise. Like, it's really nice to see. I mean, you guys had CCA, like, I don't know if the students know like how lucky they are, but like it's just like an
Yeah.
incredibly dense, rich faculty, including James that just gave us a great idea for an essay. So checks
Yeah.
in the mail. I think that the like we are the heat map, right? It was kind of a lark to just see what would happen. And we had a little bit of money in the budget left to do the thermal scan. And I think that I'm not sure we know how to use it yet, but I like the idea that it could become a motivating form of representation. So that's maybe where the drawing goes, and then the question for us, I think, is like, if that is an analytical technique that sets up a kind of conversation about effects that may not be purely visual, I think now the question is like, how do we instrumentalize that going forward? So I don't have an answer for it yet, but I would say that like our approach will definitely not be like using the analysis to then try to like problem solve or compensate for the thermal question. I think we'll look more closely into how to think carefully about how, even just as James is alluding to here, like these kind of like microclimates that we're able to start managing through the color. And so that might lead us down a completely different path. And that's really exciting, because I think that like, that's kind of why we try to find new ways to draw the projects over and over. And like, I can think the thermal scan is almost in a way like, when you get your project out and you like put new graphics on it for the portfolio, and then suddenly like you rethink the project completely because you've drawn it differently. I'd rather look at the thermal scan as a drawing than as a kind of perfunctory image.
Mhm. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I'm going to be thinking about that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I tried my best to answer it.
The other
Sorry.
thing is just, but we're like, we're architects, but we're citizens of the US, the
Oh,
world,
yeah.
whatever. Like, so when we, when they're talking about like the work on shade territories at the US-Mexico border, like, while that may not relate exactly to what we're doing, like, we can't help but not be affected and interested when we see communities and neighborhoods that don't have proper shading, like the one we were working in Chicago, right? Like, we can't not like, we just, as humans, we just can't not try to do our best for the community we're working in, or the people we're working with, or the topic. Like, we understand that there are these issues in the world that are hugely important. And as architects, we don't often get a chance to impact those. But when we do, like, we'd really love to do that. The impact we do mostly is just as humans, but we love it when our work can intersect with those issues.
Yeah, and I love these references you're bringing up. I mean, John May's work is absolutely brilliant. And I think that like, even just the fact that like, if we think about drawing the project that way, would we like redraw the Longhouse and its exterior spaces differently, and think, much more critically about, like the spatiality of that project more as like a set of climates than as a set of like figures. And that's really exciting, because I think that also we were interested in establishing, especially because the project was designed in a COVID era, like more kind of like stratification between interior and exterior. We all suddenly appreciate our exterior spaces so much more. And Longhouse is a COVID project because it just like, the pockets of space inside and these kind of like modules are fine. They're designed to like just make the plan absorb change. But the crooks and unusable crannies that have to be evacuated create these like amazing double height porches. That's the whole project. It's just a game to get those. And so now thinking about those as like climactic is like, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Thanks for dropping a really productive question there on the internet. And I love thinking about what will happen to your drawing when the climactic is maybe perhaps prioritized over the visual and organizational.
Yeah.
Mhm.
you know, which is now clearly like the strong hand in the game for you. And I think the spin begins with the Longhouse project, at least for me. A kind of, you know, different, and the heat mapping for sure, which provoked this. Erik, Ashley, thank you so much. This was a really wonderful talk, and thanks to my colleagues for a really wonderful discussion. It makes me regret all the more that we're not together in space, in a room or in the nave or somewhere actually like talking, where we could just let this run out, probably until all hours of the night. But we will bring you to California, to San Francisco, when we are able, because I really think like what you're doing is very much in dialogue with things that are happening at CCA, in interesting and not obvious ways, which is what makes it so fascinating, right? It's not like obvious affinities. It's really like oblique, productive, weird affinities, which, you know, I would like to see more of. So thanks again, Adam. Thank you for drawing codes, and for suggesting that Erik and Ashley join us for this. Brandice, Jamie left. Thank you so much for putting drawing codes on the walls over at Hubble Street. If you're a CCA community member and haven't seen it, you really need to get over there and see it. It's an incredible show. And one day there will be a book with this. And so Erik from Australia, who I think has left us, maybe that's another place to look at generative, like some information about generative drawing. But certainly the Digital Craft Lab website is a place to get some more information about generative drawing. So thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate you all being here, and it's wonderful to see you. And we'll see you next week for Norman Kelly's lecture. Good night.
Awesome.
Good night, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.